Welcome back. Picking up where we left off last week, we read in Chapter 10 of Wuthering Heights that the first couple months of Catherine and Edgar Linton's marriage pass rather pleasurably. This is due in large part, however, to the fact that the whole household is still under the doctor's orders to let Catherine have her own way, which is always a recipe for disaster when it comes to somebody with Catherine's temperament. We know from reading this far that Kathy is like a spoiled child who never grows up, and who's also vindictive and can play off of people's sympathy for her in order to get her way. Nellie, rightly, refers to her as something of a tyrant. And maybe you've met somebody before who's like this a bit, although hopefully not to this extent. Some people really like to tug on others' heartstrings to get their way, to take advantage of their sympathy. In his novella, which we've looked at earlier in the year, Notes from Underground, Fyodor Dostoevsky writes about a character who is chronically ill and in a weakened state, and who eventually comes to enjoy their misery, and to enjoy making others around them miserable as well. And I think it's speaking to something true about human nature, because there is something to the expression that misery loves company. And it makes the invalid feel better to know that they're being a pain and a burden to others who would otherwise be enjoying their free time. It's kind of a form of bullying, if you want to think about it like that. And it's a form of it that's embraced by bullies who don't have the physical means of intimidation available to them. And Catherine actually freely admits to this at one point. She says that she wants to make Edgar and Heathcliff suffer for having upset her, but she lacks the means to do so, and she says, "I'll break their hearts by breaking my own." She knows that they both care for her, and so she tries to injure herself in a spiteful attempt to injure the person that she knows they both love, and it just happens to be herself. But it takes things a while to come to that point. Because at first, Edgar and the Linton household give way to her every passing whim. She's clearly the domineering spirit of the household, and the Lintons are passive. Nellie remarks that it's hard even for someone as peevish as Catherine to fly into a rage at something when she meets absolutely no resistance. She's always right, she always gets her way. If there's the slightest inconvenience, she doesn't have to argue about whether or not she caused it or someone else. They're going to just assume that they were in the wrong and give Kathy what she wants. But then, their reasonably happy life is disrupted. Heathcliff comes home. Where's he been? We don't get an answer from him, but he's clearly used the intervening years to improve himself. He's dressed like a gentleman, and he speaks like a gentleman. Now, Nellie, in her conjectures, gives us a number of possibilities as to where he's been, and the one that she thinks most likely is that he's been in the army. Now, at the time, the army was a way for someone of Heathcliff's social standing to distinguish themselves as well as to make a living. There would have been a demand for troops well exceeding the supply, with Great Britain fighting in two major wars at the time. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which was instigated by the Dutch trading with Britain's enemies, and the Second War with those enemies themselves, the American colonists in the War of Independence. It might be kind of hard to imagine Heathcliff as one of the British redcoats referred to by Paul Revere when he sounded the alarm that the British were coming, right? But the army at that time would have had many colorful, strange characters, some of them unsavory in its ranks. In Jane Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice, we see that George Wickham joins the army, and he gains a measure of respectability from it, after having squandered his inheritance that was left to him by his landlord, and after being banned from the estate in disgrace after trying to corrupt his landlord's daughter. So Heathcliff wouldn't have been the only person on the run, so to speak, to join the army. It's a more likely picture than him going off to college, which is another speculation that Nellie has. But at any rate, even though he seems to have made a fortune and to have gotten his act together, he's still not on the same social standing as Edgar and Catherine. When he comes back to visit, Edgar is a bit flustered and upset about his wife, a magistrate's wife, gushing and getting all excited about the return of the plowboy, as he calls him. Now, this might make Edgar seem unfavorable to our eyes, in the same way that Hindley comes off as a snob in the previous chapters, by drawing distinctions between his family members and the servants. But really, for the time, comments like these wouldn't have been considered prejudice or elitist. Edgar and Hindley are part of what was called the landed gentry. Now, that's actually where the term gentleman comes from. Nowadays, to be gentlemanly is to behave a certain way. But it was initially a defined social class made up of those who owned country estates that were large enough in order to make an income off of alone without needing to work elsewhere. Remember that the series of reform bills, the first one passed in 1832, which I've mentioned a couple times now, they were attempts to extend voting rights to British citizens outside of this group of particular people. The landed gentry were seen as having superior blood to their tenants or others in the country. Even a gentleman who was relatively poor in comparison with the new class of merchants and manufacturers that were rising up, as perhaps we could think of the Earnshaws being, they would still be afforded more respect and consideration than someone who didn't own land at all. So this explains Edgar's reluctance to let Heathcliff come visiting too frequently. It also explains why Heathcliff decides to woo Edgar's sister, Isabella Linton. Now, in fairness, it is Isabella who initially throws herself in his way. She accuses Catherine of hogging Heathcliff all to herself, and Catherine, being the vindictive person that she is, tells him about Isabella's affection for him, right when they're all gathered together, making her embarrassed and making her into a spectacle. But this comes back to bite her, as vindictive actions usually do. Heathcliff is initially repulsed by the idea of being in love with Isabella. You can tell that he views himself so much superior to the Lintons that he thinks of them as being subhuman. He actually refers to them as creatures and animals, and even as things throughout the novel, and Catherine does too. But then he pauses for a moment, and he asks, "Wait a second, isn't Isabella her brother's heir?" And a mischievous smile starts to spread across his face, kind of like the Grinch on How the Grinch Stole Christmas, right? He's up to something. Because the way that old Mr. Linton had left his estate is that if Edgar doesn't have a male heir, the whole thing passes to Isabella and any male heirs that she might have after his death. That might seem like a strange arrangement, but that's how it's set up. So now Heathcliff sees an opportunity of getting the one thing that he can't get through his own efforts, whether honorable or dishonorable. And that's an opportunity to get into the favored social class, to become a member of the landed gentry. Now, for this to happen, of course, Edgar would have to die before Catherine had any male children, but we don't get the impression that Heathcliff would be too upset about that. We don't know what he's capable of. We don't know where he's been, and we don't know what he's planning to do, so maybe Edgar's life is in danger here. Heathcliff has also moved in with Hindley, of all people, up at Wuthering Heights. Nellie tells us that Hindley has been gambling all of his money away, and we later learn that Heathcliff has generously offered to supply him with funds to continue his bad habit, thus putting Hindley deeply in the debt of his old enemy. But stories about wild nights up at the Heights don't dissuade Isabella at all. She persists in thinking that Heathcliff is this upstanding character, a bit of a Byronic hero, but with an inner heart of gold. And it's actually the same mistake that Lockwood made at the beginning of the novel. A lot of these characters project their own ideas onto Heathcliff about who he is or what his motives are, but they're all delusional. And Cathy tries to tell Isabella this, painting a really unflattering picture of what he's really like to her, but she won't believe her. She's blinded to his real character in much the same way that her brother Edgar is blinded to Catherine's character. Remember that in last week's readings, for example, he caught a glimpse of Catherine's deceitful nature as well as her temper when she slapped him and he almost left the heights. But he's drawn back to her because he's smitten. Well, emotionally smitten, but he was also physically smitten. Sorry, I didn't mean to make a pun there. But in the same way, Heathcliff, he gives Isabella a glimpse of who he really is before she runs away with him. He hangs up her dog from a hook on a wall by a handkerchief. Now, luckily, Nellie saves it a few minutes later. The dog doesn't die. But he does this almost as if to warn Isabella of who he really is. He's saying, "Here are my true colors. Are you sure you still want to be with me?" And she goes with him. Once again, as I mentioned before, love can blind us, not just to others, but to the faults and undesirable qualities of the beloved one themselves. Well, the scales fall from Isabella's eyes rather quickly. Heathcliff treats her abominably on their honeymoon. We're not told how specifically. The novel is vague, so we don't really know what he does or what he says. All we know is that Heathcliff does say that he's careful not to give her any legal reasons for divorce. So it's probably a lot of psychological torture, but nothing too bloodthirsty or cruel. He's using prudence in his interactions with her, even though he despises her, in the same way that he is towards Hindley. We know that he'd like to throttle Hindley and be revenged, but he's keeping his hatred and his temper in check in order to exact a more thorough, long-term revenge. So, Isabella writes to Nellie from Wuthering Heights and asks her if Heathcliff is a man or a fiend. And this isn't the first time that this comparison has been made in the novel. There's constant references to his being a fiend, an imp, or a devil. The references are so persistent, we might even be led to question whether or not this is factually the case. But then there are other moments where he shows his human side, his human passion, and his human weakness. I think the imagery linking him with otherworldly beings adds to the atmosphere of the ghost story that Emily Bronte is trying to tell. But as always, in this novel, there's always a little room left for nagging doubt. Nothing is ever straightforward because we're so into the minds and into the heads of the characters. Nellie then goes to Wuthering Heights to visit Isabella and hears about what a terrible time she's been having. And while she's there, she meets Heathcliff, who wants to hear about how Catherine is doing over at the Grange. Now, while all of this drama has been going on between him and Isabella, Catherine has suffered from a psychotic breakdown, a delirium brought on by Edgar's insistence that she choose between him and Heathcliff. And for a few days, she goes untreated because Nellie thinks that she's putting on a show and she doesn't want Edgar to know about it and cave in his resolution. Now, she has good reason to suspect this, to be fair, because Catherine herself told Nellie that this was what she was going to do. She locks herself in her room and refuses to eat, works herself up into this distressed state, and Nellie keeps all this to herself. But Catherine's plan is to make herself deathly sick in earnest, not just in jest. And when Nellie discovers this, Catherine has already undergone a sickening change while locked up in her room. She's hallucinating. She's talking to people who aren't really there. And then, curiously enough, she seems to have suffered from some form of amnesia. She describes this experience as having suddenly been teleported in time, from her childhood to the present day, from the Heights to the Grange, without any knowledge of what happened in between. She looks in a mirror and sees a grown woman and doesn't recognize herself. She's mentally 12 years old again. She says this: the whole last 7 years of my life grew a blank. I did not recall that they had been at all. And then a little bit further down: but supposing at 12 years old I had been wrenched from the Heights, at every early association, and my all in all, as Heathcliff was at that time, and been converted at a stroke into Mrs. Linton, the lady of Thrushcross Grange, and the wife of a stranger. An exile an outcast thenceforth from what had been my world. You may fancy a glimpse of the abyss where I groveled. Shake your head as you will, Nellie. You have helped to unsettle me. You should have spoken to Edgar, indeed you should, and compelled him to leave me quiet. Oh, I'm burning. I wish I were out of doors. I wish I were a girl again, half savage and hardy and free, and laughing at injuries, not maddening under them. So this is a really vivid, interesting concept to imagine. Maybe we would all be shocked if we woke up 10 years in the future or so and saw what had become of our lives and didn't know how we got there. But, and this is interesting, it also ties into Lockwood's dream of Catherine's ghost back in the beginning of the novel. The ghost that comes to the window and begs to be let in isn't the ghost of a woman. It's the ghost of a young girl, a waif. So there's a sense in which Catherine has spiritually failed to grow up and has remained at heart a child. And this would explain the petty deceptions and the temper tantrums that we've come to recognize as kind of her trademark. And it also makes sense when we consider that there wasn't really anyone to take her by the hand and show her how to be an adult after her father died. Hindley left her to her own devices. We can't really say that the novel definitively suggests this. The language of being childlike could be largely metaphorical, but I think that it's an interpretation that sheds light on many of Catherine's personality flaws and the actions that she takes. So Edgar eventually discovers how bad of a condition Catherine is in, and he blames Nellie for keeping it a secret from him. The doctor is summoned, and they're able to gradually nurse her back to physical health, but the doctor warns that her intellect may have been permanently damaged. Her mind is still wandering. Nellie tells Heathcliff all this when she goes to visit Isabella, and Heathcliff determines to go see her once again, because he doesn't think Edgar has it in his character to show the proper amount of love to make Catherine feel comfortable as she's trying to come back to health. And here's where we start to see the depths of his feelings for Catherine, of Heathcliff's feelings. We've already heard her talk a lot about her feelings for him, but he's given us reason to doubt his constancy, right? Troubling her domestic life, marrying Isabella, for starters. But now he says this. He says at one point that he thought that maybe Catherine had given up her regard for him when she married Edgar, but now he knows better. He says, "Yet I was a fool to fancy for a moment that she valued Edgar Linton's attachment more than mine. If he loved with all the powers of his puny being, he couldn't love as much in 80 years as I could in a day. And Catherine has a heart as deep as I have. The sea could be as readily contained in that horse trough as her whole affection be monopolized by him. Tush! He is scarcely a degree dearer to her than her dog or her horse. It is not in him to be loved like me. How can she love in him what he has not?" So he's very much like Catherine in that he imagines his love to be this all-encompassing, all-in-all sort of emotion. Other people can't love like they can. They don't have the natural capacity for it. They're animals in comparison. And I think all the animal imagery is really interesting, especially since Heathcliff and Cathy both refer to others around them as animals, in the sense that they are incapable of understanding their grand, sweeping passions that they feel for each other. But there's a sense in which it's actually the two of them who have been reduced to an animal state through their love for each other. Heathcliff is compared over and over again to a dog and a wolf throughout these chapters and into the next ones as well. Cathy has been reduced to a near comatose state, a ruin of humanity, as Nellie says. So while they think that everybody else around them are like animals, they themselves are being the most animal-like or subhuman. We can probably make a comparison here between the effect that love is having on the two of them and the effect that Victor Frankenstein's all-consuming passion had on him. Remember that he also viewed himself as someone who is above the common herd of humanity. People are going to hail him as the benefactor of his race. But in reality, his project drained the life out of him, both his mental vigor and his physical strength. He became a half-starved, pale, slouching creature as he worked to bring life to his creation in his lab, ignoring all of the things about life that truly make us human, right? Family, friends, scenes of nature. So there's a real arrogance that accompanies both of their falls, as well as a blindness to their true conditions, which I think is true of, we could probably say it's true of sin in general. One of Christ's critiques of the church of Laodicea in the book of Revelation, I think it's in chapter 3, is that he says that they think they're rich, increased with goods, and have need of nothing. And so this is a self-superiority. But in reality, they're wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked, and know it not. One of the tragedies of stories like Wuthering Heights or like Frankenstein is that we, as outside observers, can see the errors that these characters are falling into, but they themselves are blind to their mistakes until it's too late. And that blindness comes from pride, from self-sufficiency, thinking that it's possible to control one's own life and the environment around them without reference to God, which, as I've said before, was one of the chief faults of the 19th century in general. So for next week, read chapters 15 to 20, or if your edition of the novel happens to be split up into 2 volumes, like it was originally when it was published, that will be volume 2, chapters 1 through 6. Thanks.